Good evening, and thank you for joining us for this virtual Northshire event. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Rachel Person, Events Director for Northshire Bookstore, with store locations in Manchester Center, Vermont, and Saratoga Springs, New York. Thank you so much for your loyalty and support of independent bookselling. Both of this evening's authors' books are available for purchase in both Northshire Bookstore locations and on our website at northshire.com. A little bit later on, I'll drop a link in the chat to a page on our website where you can find them, and you will also have received that link in your email when you registered for this event. Folks attending who are within easy distance of our Saratoga Springs store, tickets are available now for our event with Rick Atkinson on his forthcoming book, The Fate of the Day. That event will be taking place on Friday, May 30th, and you can find tickets and information at northshire.com. A logistical note, throughout the evening, you can put questions for our authors in the chat or in the Q&A box that you'll find at the bottom of your screen. We will save those questions up, and I will be back to pose them for you a little bit later on. Those are my boring notes. I'm delighted this evening to welcome John R. Maass and Mark Edward Lender for an event in honor of Maass's new book, From Trenton to Yorktown, which comes out tomorrow. So we are among the first to be hearing about it. John R. Maass is a staff member at the National Museum of the U.S. Army at Fort Belvoir. In addition to From Trenton to Yorktown, his books on U.S. military history include North Carolina and the French and Indian War, Defending a New Nation, 1783 to 1811, The Road to Yorktown, George Washington's Virginia, and the Battle of Guilford Courthouse. He's joined this evening by Mark Edward Lender, Professor Emeritus of History at Kean University, who is the author or co-author of 12 books and many articles on early American military, social, and institutional history, including Cabal, The Plot Against George Washington, Fatal Sunday, George Washington, The Monmouth Campaign and the Politics of Battle with Gary Wheeler Stone, and A Respectable Army, The Military Origins of the Republic, 1763 to 1789, with James Kirby Martin. Please join me in welcoming them both to our screens this evening.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it, Rachel, and thanks also to those listening. And I also want to thank Mark Lender for participating tonight in this dual format. Mark is not only a great historian and has written some excellent books on the Revolutionary period, but he also did me the favor of reading basically, I bet 80% of the manuscript in some form or the other. So he's very familiar with the book that is coming out tomorrow. So thank you very much for having both Mark and I. We're glad to be here. And folks, I thought what I would do was just start out a little bit about the structure of the book. And that way, for folks who haven't read about it, it does come out tomorrow. This is the first event that we have, that I'm talking about the book. So I'm glad to kick this off here. The book is structured around 5 turning points that I have posited are the 5 decisive moments or episodes, battles, campaigns of the Revolutionary War. That's not to say that I go through and declare all other battles unimportant or insignificant, but my thesis is that these 5 were the ones that were turning points. And those 5, no surprise to most of you, are the Trenton-Princeton campaign of 1776 and just into 77, the Saratoga campaign of 1777, the Valley Forge encampment, which began in December of 77 and into June of 78, the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, North Carolina, and that associated campaign that was basically the events of 1780 and 1781 in South and North Carolina. And then finally, the Yorktown campaign of 1781. So those are the 5 that I feel are the turning points of the Revolutionary War, or the most significant ones. But before we even get to talking about those 5, I want to define my terms and what I mean by turning point. And what I'm talking about here, I'm only going to read 2 very small passages from the book, just to clarify what I'm talking about. And trust me, I'm not going to read huge swaths about the book at any moment tonight. Mark and I are going to talk about this instead. But what I mean by a turning point, and this is from my introduction, is it refers to battles, campaigns, sieges, and other military events that are decisive and result in a significant change that alters the trajectory of the conflict toward the war's outcome, which would mean American victory. So, again, maybe simplifying that a little bit more, what were the events that really were those that altered the way the war turned out in such a way that resulted in an American victory, the most significant ones? And those of you who read military history might be familiar with Victor Davis Hanson, who's mostly a classicist and a classical military historian. But he has a quote in one of his books, and this is the last thing I will read, that really struck me, and I included this in the introduction, and that is about battles. Battles alter history for centuries in a way others cannot. In this vein, my book attempts to show which events of the Revolutionary War were crucial to achieving American independence and altered history for going on 2.5 centuries now. And this is the 250th anniversary year of 1775, which includes Lexington and Concord, and also the birth of the U.S. Army on June 14th, 1775. So that's my definition of what I'm talking about by a turning point, the significant event that alters the trajectory of the war. So let Mark talk a little bit about this. And Mark, what are your thoughts on either my definition, or do you have a different definition, or thoughts that you've had over the years as you've studied the Revolutionary War?
Let me compliment you, and I'm not trying to push your book on people, but I'd like folks to understand one of the things you've done in selecting not just these 5 incidents or episodes as being trajectory altering, but in a sense, you have broken with a good deal of modern historical thinking about the importance of battles. I mean, Hansen is right, and I agree with him. But there has been a real current out there among military historians to de-emphasize the importance of individual engagements, individual battles, in favor of one called it the allure of battle, that battles are dramatic. They are the romance of military history, so to speak. And they attract attention, but at the same time, they, particularly in long wars, it's very relatively rare to find a single engagement or a number of engagements that you can say really knocked the other side out, or really clearly determined the outcome of the war. The counter argument was it's who's got the best infrastructure to keep a military in the field, who's got the better political staying power, all sorts of arguments that point away from decisive engagements in the field. You've reversed that. Hansen has said it, and I think that pithy quote you used is actually a favorite of mine. But in selecting these 5, well, my friend, it took a little guts. I mean, you've got some folks who are going to look at this and say, wait a minute, what about Lexington and Concord? Why didn't that get in on your list? And we'll talk about that. Why not Lexington and Concord? Why was it not decisive, in as much as it was the first real kickoff to military resistance to the empire?
Well, I'd like to say about that, and first of all, thank you for the compliments of the book. Lexington and Concord was important. It showed that there was a sizable contingent of rebels, as the British military and civil hierarchy would call them, rabble or something like that, there was a sizable amount that could be mobilized for a limited amount of time and be successful in defeating the British. But I would say, as far as an event that turned the trajectory toward eventual winning, it's too early in the war really to pin that on Lexington and Concord. Again, it was a significant event, but the war lasted militarily another 6 years after that, 6.5 years in the field. So it's a little bit hard to say that was an earth-shattering, major, history-turning type of event. That's how I look at that.
And I'm sure you're going to get historians who point to other battles. I can think right now of Kings Mountain, which pretty dramatic, but actually, when you didn't include Kings Mountain, I sort of, wait a minute, why not Kings Mountain? And for readers out, or for folks who are listening out there, I don't know, you want to go into Kings Mountain and explain why you convinced me, by the way, that it doesn't belong. But it was one of these things I looked at and said, wait a minute. Why not something like Kings Mountain, which was incredibly dramatic?
Well, what I was thinking about is to talk briefly about each of the 5 points I have chronologically, and then also talk about, while we're doing that, mention those battles like Kings Mountain, like this battle called Monmouth Courthouse that you know something about, and or Cowpens or things like that. So one way we can do that, folks in the audience, is let's look at the first part of the war. Washington was really drubbed at Long Island in 1776, New York, Harlem Heights, White Plains, Kips Bay, Fort Washington in New York City fell, Fort Lee in New Jersey fell. These were all major defeats that really weren't even close. Howe, who was the commander in chief of the British Army at the time in New York, General William Howe, he regarded them as complete victories, and yet did those victories really amount to knocking the Americans out of the war? And of course, the answer is no. It did not. Part of that, which is a total side issue, which is Howe's reluctance to attack Washington when he clearly had him up against the ropes and ready for a knockout blow, and that's why it did not knock Washington out. It did not destroy the American cause, and that's why my first turning point instead is Washington's victories at Trenton and at Princeton. And Mark, the reason I went with that one, and I'm not the only one who does. Other writers also point to that as one of the key turning points. But Washington was chased across northern New Jersey, and when he got across the Delaware River, he was down to 2,500 men, or Continentals, whose enlistments were just about to expire. And really, in a way, the British just had to wait until the Delaware froze over so they could walk across and attack his camps. But he managed, and the Americans managed. It wasn't just Washington. He had some key commanders, Joseph Reed for one, and others that were able to turn the tide and see this almost through desperation. I think you'd say they had no other choice. They had an army for another week and a half, and the weather looked good at the time, and they were able to deliver what looked like a minor victory at Trenton because they captured 1,000 Hessians. but turned that into another successful defense of Trenton on January 2nd, and then pretty much an honest to goodness victory, which changed morale, changed the way the country saw the war. Congress was certainly helped by that. That to me was a trajectory changing a battle that meant that Washington would have an army.
I fully agree. I mean, I don't think it was, if you're looking at turning points in the War for Independence, it's impossible to ignore the Trenton-Princeton campaign. And I think you've driven that point home. I've always wondered, looking at it from the point of William Howe, if you or I were in command of the British Army, no, and it's sort of unfair because looking back, we're looking at it from the perspective of 2025, not 1776. But even from 1776, I find it amazing that William Howe, a consummate professional, and with very competent officer corps, well-trained troops, well supplied, high morale. I mean, as you pointed out, they've chased Washington out of New York, chased him across New Jersey, and yet, with victory within reach, he stops. I mean, I think, and in jest, I mentioned this to you at some point in the past, I'm sure in our discussions, but I think December 13th ought to be an American national holiday. I mean, to have William Howe stop his campaign, saying that's enough for now, and we'll put this chain of outposts across New Jersey, and we'll clean up anything that's left in the spring. I mean, why didn't I'm just still incredulous. Why didn't he push on? He could have crossed the Delaware. If nothing else, they could have brought up the bridging equipment in less than a week, and they could have crossed the Delaware. You ever put yourself in William Howe's position and try and figure out why he didn't go through with it?
Yeah, well, I agree 100%. And I go into this a little bit in the text and explain it a little bit more in a footnote, but not nearly as much, just because of the space concerns that we had in the book, about what some historians have called the Bunker Hill effect on Howe. And that Howe was the commander on the field at the Battle of Bunkers Hill, which, as most of you might know, happened on Breed's Hill, not Bunker Hill. And rather than have as kind of a complex strategic landing in the Americans' rear, Howe decided to make frontal assaults against the American defenses on Breed's Hill, and made two very bloody charges against the American positions, which were dug in or behind fences. Lost 1,000 redcoats, which was a major part of the force. Many officers, long-serving officers, young officers were killed in the battle. And if you look at Howe's record after that, he had Washington on the ropes at Brooklyn, and one more charge would have driven the Americans into the East River and the Hudson River, but he didn't launch a frontal assault. Same thing at other White Plains and what have you. It might be that he was averse to wanting to absorb casualties that would have needed to have been replaced from Great Britain, and those troops were hard to come by. Trained troops were hard to come by. I think he was gun shy at that point.
I guess I can't think of any other reason. But then there's the other issue, and now we're talking about Cornwallis. All right, at Second Trenton, on the Assunpink Creek. Cornwallis decides not to force the issue in the evening. He'd been shot up trying to cross the bridge to get at Washington. All right, wait till the morning. But then Washington slips away, and you do a great job with this, by the way. How Washington slips away and really wins a victory in the field at Princeton. But as Washington is pulling out of Princeton, heading north, Cornwallis is chasing him. He's coming in just as Washington's pulling out. Trenton was a raid. The first Trenton was a raid. Second Trenton fought very, very hard. But now Cornwallis is on the trail of Washington after Princeton. Howe has troops to the east in New Jersey. Why didn't they chase Washington? There's another chance to finish him off. I'm just astonished.
And Cornwallis gets a reputation later in the war in the South of being a hard charger and, straight at them. Let's attack the Americans. I'm thinking mostly Camden and Guilford Courthouse. And the I don't want to shortchange the significance of these battles, because really my chapters are succinct narratives of the battles, but I try to go into why they were so important. And I think Mark, you're a better person than me to detail that on these battles because of your familiarity with New Jersey. But this totally revitalized a huge amount of northern New Jersey, which meant militia began to trickle in by the spring. There was new hope, and Congress began to maybe think of things differently at this point. As far as Washington, as far as the Army, this really also showed that Washington was appointed commander in June of 75. This is almost 18. Well, this is 18 months later. He finally was able to demonstrate that he could win a battle or two and act aggressively and make good decisions.
I think it was his best showing in the war to date. It really was. And I to see Trenton Princeton as you put it, a trajectory changing operation, there's no question about it. I mean, I think it was well chosen as one of your chapters. And I think the whole thing, the drama of it has attracted people for 250 years now. It really has.
Yeah.
And speaking of this one,
speaking of drama, since our hosts this evening have a Saratoga location, it would be very rude of us if we did not go talk about Saratoga as one of the major events, and clearly this is. This was it was. I won't go into the details of the campaign that much, other than say this was a sprawling campaign from Canada to New York City out to the Great Lakes, and it was one of the it was conducted in probably the most difficult logistical area in North America, or at least on the eastern seaboard, at least in the 13 colonies. And also, as historian Andrew O'Shaughnessy has pointed out in his excellent book, "The Men Who Lost America," and Eric Schnitzer as well as his book on Saratoga. The British leadership and command organization was hopelessly flawed, and I think with the American victory, which seemed incredibly improbable. What are your thoughts on calling Saratoga a turning point, and was it the turning point?
Well, as far as Saratoga goes, and I've always wondered, going through the literature of the campaign, how anyone could question Saratoga's place as one of the most important turning points, not just in the history of the war for independence, but in the history of the country generally. If Saratoga had not worked out, if Burgoyne had successfully pushed through to Albany, if Howe, instead of chasing Washington in the Philadelphia area, or even if Clinton had had enough troops left in New York City to go north up the Hudson River and forge a junction with Burgoyne, and that would have implied the defeat of American forces in front of either one of those thrusts, either up the river or coming down from Canada. I don't know that the cause of independence could have survived. This is another reprieve. And Trenton, Princeton was the great reprieve. Morale rebounded. But if a year later, the British had successfully destroyed forces that would have been pulverized, really, because they'd have been the ones without logistical support. They'd have been the ones without numerical reinforcement, and cut New England off from the colonies to the south. I don't know that the revolution could have survived 2 catastrophic years in a row.
Yeah.
Historians do have occasionally bridle at other historians' interpretations, but I've often wondered what some of our colleagues were thinking in not giving Saratoga really the lion's share of credit for French recognition, which was absolutely critical to the American ability to maintain the war. And it was Saratoga, no matter even if Washington had won something around Philadelphia, Saratoga would have been the blow, I think, that brought France in. I think you've made that case. And I've really kind of wondered at those who had been skeptical of the critical importance of Saratoga.
Right. And you've hit on the main point that I emphasize in the book, which is that Saratoga, the victory at Saratoga, was not only the destruct. Now, let's not underestimate. I'm not saying that you're doing that, but let's not underestimate the fact that I'm guessing at the number, but some 8,000 British and Hessian troops were eliminated from being part of the forces to crush the rebellion. That's no small feat. But really, once news, and this is why I call Saratoga a turning point, a crucial shift in trajectory, is that, as Mark has just said, once the news got over to Paris and Versailles, that the Americans had defeated Burgoyne, wiped out his army, and that was what led them to decide, okay, we are going to overtly supply and arm and equip the Americans as much as we can, and also sign the 2 treaties. One was the Treaty of, I forget what the name, something, Amity and Commerce.
Right.
And then there was the military treaty too, which was in fact, if not name, a declaration of war against the British. That's how the British interpreted it, and I would too. And all of a sudden, America had a big brother that could help out, and that's why I put it. That's why I put it as one of the events.
Well, I think that decision by the French, and you're absolutely right. I mean, you take 8,000 professional troops off the board, and that's an incredible victory right there.
Yeah.
What France gave them was eventually you would have French troops on American soil, and the victory ultimately led France not just to commit troops, but to commit something the Americans could not have raised on their own, an effective navy to counter the Royal Navy. And none of this would have flowed without the victory at Saratoga.
Right. And in a few minutes when we talk about Yorktown, we'll make sure we emphasize that, hey, this French Navy that just won a key naval victory off the Capes of Virginia, and who contributed more than half of the troops on the during the siege, that's from Saratoga. But Mark, you and folks, I want to make sure the proper credit is due. I think my chapter on Valley Forge being a key turning point, I found that personally the most challenging chapter to write, to get my head wrapped around that. I kind of went back and forth on that, but this the I think too much sometimes is made of Valley Forge as the main reason it's important was because all of a sudden some German baron shows up in camp, starts drilling the troops, and then spring comes, they march out looking like an army that's brand new, ready to fight, and can do no wrong. But that really wasn't why. That really wasn't the only reason that Valley Forge was important.
No, you're right. It was not the only reason. And I don't want to take anything away from what Steuben did. But the American army that went into Valley Forge was not a rabble. They had been licked, but they remained operational. They remained operational enough that Howe decided not to attack Valley Forge over that long winter and into the spring of 1778. What you had was an army that was able to lick its wounds. I mean, there's that old sort of truism that a defeated army, given competent leadership, at least minimal supply, resupply, and time to rest and reorganize, could come out and fight again. And Valley Forge had all that combination. What you found was you had an officer corps, a Continental officer corps, that now had a couple of years of experience in the field. Washington had matured as a commander. He knew how to he knew how to connect with his men. He did not go on leave as many officers did during Valley Forge. So you had this bond between the commander in chief and the troops who remained under him. You had the states. Washington at his best politically. And I think Washington never had a better opportunity to show the difference between a mere general and a commander in chief. The commander in chief has got to handle other generals, but he's got to have the political touch that generates civilian support for the war effort. And he was in touch with the governors. It was Washington who was behind many of the decisions in the states to actually start drafting troops from the militia into the Continental Army. As brutal as the weather was, and I think there's been some tendency among some historians to de-emphasize the tribulations that the Army faced. I think it was pretty bad. I tend to disagree with that interpretation, and I think you kind of did as well. But the Army was able to recoup its numbers. You can't credit Steuben for that. He was able to train the people who came in, but you got to credit Washington and to have the political touch to actually get these recruits coming in from the states. You had other officers who matured. Look at Henry Knox, who rebuilt Continental artillery. And then go back to your choice of Saratoga. Now you have overt French arms coming in. And at Valley Forge, those arms are put into the hands of the troops. You have you were never able to get enough Charleville muskets from the French to completely re-equip the army, but you had them coming in, and you had any number of regiments now that had the best that Europe could supply. The captured cannon from Burgoyne's army, the new pieces that crossed the Atlantic from France ended up in Knox's hands. By the end of Valley Forge, you had Continental artillery that could go one-on-one with the Royal Artillery. And at Monmouth, the artillery went one-on-one. I mean, you're talking about line of sight between rival artillery crews at Monmouth, blazing away at one another. And the Continentals did just as well. So this was a turning point. I fully agreed. I read your account of Valley Forge very closely. I mean, as you know, I've written a bit on Valley Forge myself. But this was, I don't know how Washington could have maintained himself in the field without that experience of Valley Forge. This was not just an education or rebirth of the Army, but I think it was a solidification of Washington's command of that Army.
Yeah, and I tried to go into that by explaining that Washington felt disrespected, threatened, whatever the word would be, by some members of Congress who did not think that he should retain command of the Army. Some of the officers that served on this board of war were not his friends. And one of the ways, we can't go into too much detail because of the time tonight, but one of the ways, folks, that Washington um, solved this perceived dispute with Congress was to invite a committee of them to Valley Forge to see the conditions, to see what was happening, to see that he wasn't lying or exaggerating the lack of food and supplies. And when they did see that, they worked with him. It was a congressional committee, and they worked with him to try to solve the problems, which were never totally solved, but they were solved enough, and they were it was good enough. And so some of the folks who've read parts of this or have heard me talk a little bit about this in prior events and presentations, they want to talk about Monmouth, the Battle of Monmouth Courthouse, in 1778 after Valley Forge, as this other turning point. But really, the Army, as I see it and I write, is the results of Monmouth come from Valley Forge. And so Valley Forge is the turning points, and one of the ways you can see that is by looking at Monmouth, which you
No,
have done.
I think you're right. I mean, as you know, I've written quite a bit about Monmouth, and my argument has always been that look, it was a tactical draw, but it was a political triumph for Washington, and it was the capstone on what he had accomplished at Valley Forge. I mean, you mentioned that committee at camp. The American taxpayer has never gotten as much out of a congressional committee as they did with that one, and frankly, we again look to a maturing commander in chief. There's that old adage politically: whoever sets the agenda wins. When that committee came to Valley Forge,
Yeah.
Washington had teamed up with Alexander Hamilton, and they had drafted a 30-page memorandum of what that presented this to that committee coming in, and that was the agenda they worked from. And they did their jobs. Washington did his job, and that Army not just survived, it revived. It was a resurgence that I don't think could have taken place without the cooperation of that committee, because it was that committee going back to Congress that said, look, Washington's not fooling. It's as desperate as he said. This is what we need to do. They brought the rest of Congress around. You had some diehards. We can even name names, but that's outside of our talk tonight, I guess. But you had diehards who never came around, but enough came around to get the job done.
Yeah.
So I think you're right. Valley Forge has got to be on your list, and I think you did it very nicely.
Thank you. Well, my fourth turning point is a southern battle. The war, for various reasons, began to shift more actively to the south, beginning in 1779. And there were a series of battles, and some of you in the audience are familiar with them. But rather than call every battle in the South to have its own campaign, my interpretation, my framework is that from the British capture of Charleston, South Carolina, with its large garrison in May of 1780, I regard that as the start of what I call the Carolinas campaign of 1780 to 1781. And within that framework, you have the not only Charleston, but also the battles of Camden, South Carolina, Kings Mountain, South Carolina, Cowpen, South Carolina, Guilford Courthouse, North Carolina, Hobkirk's Hill, North Carolina, and a few others, Utah Springs, 96, South Carolina. And so what I did, and most of my work in Revolutionary War history is on the South for the last 25 years. But I provided an overarching look at these battles in that I just mentioned. And what I was doing is looking at which of those battles changed the trajectory of events in the South from what they had been to a new direction that ultimately led to victory. And so I won't get into the nuts and bolts of every battle, but just an overview of my thinking was General Cornwallis was in charge of the British effort after the fall of Charleston. Once the Henry Clinton, the British commander-in-chief there, went back. So there was the Battle of Camden. Cornwallis won for the British, and he advanced toward North Carolina. That was his objective, was to conquer North Carolina. Now, the Americans won a victory 6 weeks later at Camden, and Cornwallis fell back to regroup. He then advanced again, and the Americans won another victory at Cowpens. Cornwallis kept advancing into North Carolina. There were some minor battles in February of 1781. Cornwallis kept advancing into North Carolina. So Kings Mountain did not end his effort to conquer North Carolina. Cowpens did not end his efforts to conquer North Carolina. The one battle that led him to retreat to the Atlantic Ocean and leave North Carolina was the Battle of Guilford Courthouse in North Carolina, March 15, 1781. And because of that, that's why I identify that as the battle that really changed the trajectory, because within 6 weeks after the battle, Cornwallis was not in North Carolina anymore. In fact, only 200 British redcoats were in North Carolina. They never stood a chance of conquering North Carolina. And as events would show, they eventually evacuated South Carolina, except for Charleston, within 6 months. So that's, and I know what you were saying earlier. A lot of folks point to Cowpens because it's a pretty interesting battle. It's kind of fun to read about, or Kings Mountain because Thomas Jefferson said that was the turning point of the Revolutionary War in the South. But I don't see it that way, and that's not how I evaluate
it. Henry Clinton called it the turning point as well at Kings Mountain.
Mm-hmm.
But this is the as you know, when I read your manuscript earlier, this is the one that really got my attention. And having thought about it for a while now, I am reminded of one of my favorite quotes from the War for Independence, and it's Nathaniel Greene. We fight, get beat, rise, and fight again. Mm-hmm. And just the man could turn a phrase, he really could. But that was, in essence, what was going on. And I think maybe we've gone a little too far in even crediting Cornwallis with a tactical victory at Guilford Courthouse. He was whipped, and the only reason he could claim victory was that Greene figured that he'd done enough that day. There was no point in risking his army when he had obviously had inflicted incredible damage on Cornwallis. Cornwallis had to pull back. He didn't, and you're right, this is what threw him out of North Carolina, what brought the entire Carolinas campaign crashing down. And even to credit I don't know, how do you credit a tactical victory for a victory that cost you 2 states, or the better part of a campaign
Yes.
that had gone on over a year?
Yeah.
So there was never a credible effort upon the British part to revive their fortunes in the South after Guilford Courthouse. That was essentially it. So yes, you brought me around on that one. You really did. So,
Well, we can segue into Yorktown, our last of the battles tonight, because when Cornwallis had to retreat from the area around Guilford Courthouse because of over 25% casualties, and retreated down to Wilmington, North Carolina, on the coast. Within 2 weeks of arriving at Wilmington, he decided to abandon North Carolina without the permission of his commander in chief, Sir Henry Clinton, in New York, and marched into Virginia. And eventually, there was a campaign in Central Virginia in April, May, and June of 1781, and by September and into October, the siege of Yorktown, where the British Army was cooped up at that post on the York River, and eventually surrendered. And Saratoga and Yorktown, Mark, probably I think the easiest two battles to pick as the decisive battles of the war. The British surrendered at Yorktown, but the war went on for another 2 years. Not a lot of combat, but there was still some. And the part of Yorktown's decisiveness, if you want to break apart Yorktown to the siege on land and the naval actions, the September naval action off the coast of Virginia, in which the French defeated the British and sealed up Cornwallis and his men in Yorktown, that might have been the most decisive day of the war, um, and certainly in sealing the fate of the British here. Is there any doubt that Yorktown is a trajectory turning event?
no, not at all. I mean, it's even Lord North agreed with you on that when it was, quote, "Oh God, it is all over." But this is another one. Getting into the mind of Charles Lord Cornwallis. Um, this is a man who had little regard for his commanding officer. He did not like Henry Clinton. I think he tried to at least imply that he was smarter than Henry Clinton at every conceivable opportunity. Disobeyed orders. He left the Carolinas when think his instructions from Clinton were quite clear. You're to subdue South Carolina, and he could have done it, by the way. At least I think he could have done it. But then he leaves the Carolinas. He goes into Virginia, where he's winning. Every time the Americans stand, he beats them. And then, for some reason, and I can't get inside the man's head, he decides to obey orders and picks a post on the York River where he can get bottled up. Go figure. Any thoughts on that, John? Because I've got to tell you, while there's no question Yorktown was decisive and a war ender, in so to speak, but I once again find myself puzzling over the conduct of Charles Lord Cornwallis. I really do.
Unless he was looking for to put the blame on Clinton. Maybe he saw how this would play out, and if he decided all of a sudden start obeying orders, if the orders were coming from Clinton, that's who he hoped everything would get pinned on.
Well, to some extent, poor Clinton, and I think better of Henry Clinton than a lot of other historians do, but that's just me. And, yeah. But I don't think that I really question Cornwallis's judgment throughout the from South Carolina on,
Mhm.
I question his judgment. I
Yeah.
think a more a less tactically minded officer, a more strategically minded officer could have done much better in the South, including Virginia.
Mhm.
Uh, that's not how it came out. He did what he did, and there's no question that Yorktown was absolutely decisive. I mean, and I don't think anyone's going to argue with you on that.
Yeah. Well, Rachel, why don't we go ahead and move to questions if anybody has any, and Mark and I will do our best to come up with an answer.
Yep. We don't have a ton of time left because I wanted to let you guys go. You were having such a fascinating conversation. But we do have one question here from Robert, wanting to know, did you consider the Battle of the Capes? This could have resulted in the failure of the French to seal the British at Yorktown. Also, what do you think about the Battle of Pensacola, which could be considered the knockout blow to British control in the Gulf of Mexico?
The Gulf of America, right?
um, Robert, the Battle of the Capes is part of my chapter on Yorktown. It's totally included in there. So you get 100% agreement from me on that. You might have asked your question um, before I talked about that a little bit, but as I said, um, that was probably the single most decisive moment of the Yorktown campaign, and somebody could probably make an argument in a fun uh, journal article or something like that to say that it might have been the most decisive event of the war that one day. Of course, there were no Americans involved in that. There were British and French, so maybe that's why it's not emphasized all that much. Although I think that's changed from modern historians now. But um, as far as the Pensacola, so this kind of is brings me to the conclusion that I wrote, is a brief conclusion of why some battles aren't, is again, yes, I'm sure it was important. It eliminated British dominance in the Gulf of Mexico, but uh, whether it went the other way, would that have affected the course of the war? I would say no. I never want to call anything a sideshow because that kind of denigrates the people who fought and killed and were killed. But it was it was on the periphery. Let's put it that way.
It was, and I again, I don't want to, because of those involved, I don't want to use the term sideshow either. But in a strategic sense, let's face it, it was. Um, the British then recouped their fortunes. The Battle of the Saints, uh, the really critical part of that war, at least at that stage, were those Sugar Islands, those Caribbean colonies that the British knew were absolutely essential for maintaining their status as an empire. And that's where they put their effort. And that paid off. I mean, that part of the war worked for Great Britain. Yes, they would have preferred to hang on to Florida, but in exchange for what they won, I think they were they were correct in committing the forces where they did.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think I probably should have said this in conjunction with Saratoga. Is once the French signed those treaties with the Americans, the emphasis of the British militarily in the 13 colonies, that was reduced dramatically the minute that happened and shifted to the defense of the Sugar Islands in the West Indies. Uh, Somewhat to a degree, they shifted to the south so they could have some bases to operate on, but they just weren't going to be putting as many troops into America anymore. And after Yorktown, when they lost another, I forget, Mark, what the figure was, 8,000 men,
Yeah,
there,
about
there
that.
was no more troops coming from England. England had no more troops to send.
This is a world war at this point too. I mean, they're fighting in the still action in Gibraltar. There's commitments to the Mediterranean. You've got India. Uh, coasts of Africa. I mean, this is
not to mention the fear of a French cross-channel invasion, which they took very seriously.
Very seriously indeed. And you had a colonial rebellion morph into a world war, and you can make a good argument that the British came out of the American War for Independence a lot stronger than they went in, because their performance in the rest of their theaters was pretty impressive. I mean, it was really. Well, some historians have really considered it the birth of what, the Second British Empire. I mean, the one that really was the one on which the sun never set.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thanks for the question, Robert.
Got any more there, Rachel?
Sorry about that. We have time for one more question, and this one came in from Jack, saying, "Can you touch on the importance of the Battle of Valcour Island, and could a case be made for that as a turning point?"
Well, so part of my introduction mentions that a lot of folks who emphasize the importance of small battles, the ratio of how far they live from that battlefield is directly related to that. And I understand that too. I understand, believe me. But I would say I'm not the only one to say this either. I think Eric Schnitzer makes this point. He's the historian up at Saratoga Battlefield National Park, or National Historic Park. Valcour Island really did not delay the British at all. They fought the battle. It was a one-day affair. Arnold's force was wiped out. It didn't delay them but a few hours. They got down, the British force on water got down to the bottom, the top, I guess you would say, of Lake Champlain, decided it was too late in the war, in the season. In that season, I think they arrived in late October, early November, and they decided to turn around. But Valcour Island was an interesting event. It showed Benedict Arnold at his best. It also showed the Navy that the Army built their boats, which they've never gotten over. Other than that, that it was a minor affair. It was not an American victory, and it did not slow the British down.
And not all Americans were impressed with Arnold's performance at Valcour Island either. I mean, you had American officers. I mean, it was William Maxwell, the commander of the New Jersey, what became the New Jersey Brigade, the following year, called it, quote, "a pretty piece of admiralty." And it was, I mean, dripping with sarcasm. Look, the fleet was lost. I mean, no matter who built it the fleet was lost. The action at Valcour did not affect what Horatio Gates had done to prepare Fort Ticonderoga for the arrival of the British. And Carleton took one look. I mean, personally went to under the guns of Ticonderoga to have a look, and said, "There's probably 12,000 guys there, and we can't tackle them right now. We're going to have to do it next year."
Yeah.
Well, that was that.
Yep.
And it didn't work out real well next year at Saratoga.
Well, thank you both so much. This has been a really fascinating evening and a great event. Thank you for taking the time to talk to us tonight.
Thanks for having us.
Really appreciate it. Enjoyed it.
Thank you. Audience, you can find books by both of these authors at northshire.com and in both of our stores in Saratoga Springs, New York, and Manchester Center, Vermont. Have a great night, everyone.
Good night.
Yeah, you too. Thank you.